I would like to talk about VLANs, or virtual LANs. All of the ports on a switch are on one LAN, one network, and that is one subnet. Remember that a router is what separates networks. But now we're going to learn that you can separate networks on a switch as well, virtually, by making VLANs. So here's how we do it. We're going to take some ports, these blue ports, and make them VLAN 1. Well, they were already on VLAN 1 back here in this diagram. And then we're going to take these three green ports here and make them VLAN 2. And then these orange ports, those will be on VLAN 3. So each VLAN now we will put on a separate network. So I will have different IP networks on each of these three sets of switches or switch ports. Only PCs on the same VLAN can communicate with each other. So this one here on VLAN 2, this green one, can communicate with this green one on VLAN 2, but it cannot communicate with this orange one on VLAN 3. Likewise, of course, all of these orange ones can communicate with each other because they are on separate networks, and you cannot cross networks without a router. Now, yes, there are such things as what we call layer 3 switches, and those do allow it, but we are for now going to go simple and presume this is a standard layer 2 switch, and so this is the case. They will not communicate with each other except within their own VLANs. One point I want to make about these is that all of these ports have been configured as access ports. By that we mean they are ports that are attached to an end device. In other words, there are PCs attached to each of these ports on here, and so we call them access ports. And we configure the switch to make these access ports. There are also ports that we call trunk ports. So here in this case, I have made one port on each of these switches a trunk port, and the trunk port will tie the switches together. So what happens here is that traffic entering from PC1 is tagged as VLAN 2 traffic. It now will travel across this trunk port with that VLAN 2 tag on it and come back out on this port, and then can be distributed to all of these green ones over here, including PC7. So PC1 here can talk to PC7 over here. And in this case, these are in two different buildings. This is one of the great uses for VLANs. We can now put switches in different buildings and still keep them on separate networks. If I have some HR people, for example, in two different buildings, they can talk to each other. And some production people can talk to each other in two different buildings. However, PC5 here could not talk to PC7. 5 is on VLAN 3, 7 is on VLAN 2. So they cannot talk to each other. But the idea is that this trunk line here carries all of the VLANs, whereas these individual ports only carry one of the VLANs. So the trunk line carries traffic tagged with whatever VLAN the frames originated from. Now, it is possible for me to configure this trunk line to only carry certain VLANs and not others. That is a configuration issue, but in general, we would say that it carries all of them. And by the way, one thing I'll mention here that isn't strictly in my notes, and that is that by default, VLAN 1 is something we call the native VLAN, and that means that it does not carry any tags. So it too can cross the trunk line, and all of the blue ones here, VLAN 1, can talk to each other without any tags. That's just called the native VLAN, and we don't have to worry too much about that, except to know that we usually don't use VLAN 1 for standard traffic across our networks.